Hello everybody, welcome to Kevin's Musical Info-Rama. This first module is going to be on music notes. We're going to learn what they look like, how to identify them on the page, and what their names are. The first thing we need to know about music notes is that speakers of English have two different naming conventions for them. There's the American naming convention and the British naming convention. And if you're an American living in the United States of America, it's a good idea to memorize the American naming conventions. But you should also be familiar with the British naming conventions in case you see them in publications. American naming conventions are pretty straightforward. Each note is given a name based on its proportion to the whole note. So the whole note is the base note for American music notation. This will make more sense once we start to look at how music notes break down. They break down binarily, that means into twos. British note names are not as straightforward as American note names. They have what seems to be silly words, and they generally do not reference each other until they get to very small notes. And then they engage these prefixes like semi, demi-semi, and hemi-demi-semi. Like I said before, it's a good idea to be familiar with them. Probably won't have to memorize them, but you should be familiar with them, especially if you're in a bagpipe band and you're looking at British publications a lot, because you will see them there. Music notes break down binarily. That means they break down into twos. A good way to think about it is that two notes will add to have the same value as the note one level above. Also, each note will have exactly half the value as the note a level above. So the first note we're going to learn, and you will probably won't need this and barely will ever see it, but it does exist, so it's worth being familiar with, is the double whole note. And the double whole note is basically an open note head with zero stems with those two little lines by each side of it. The British call this a breve, or a breve, and you should be familiar with it. The whole note is really the base note for American music notation. It's a open note head, and it has no stem. The British call it a semibreve, and like I said before, it's the point of reference. It's the top of the musical pyramid. The next note is the half note, and this is comprised of an open note head with a stem. The British call this a minim, and it's equal to 1/2 of a whole note. The next note is a quarter note. It's a closed note head with a stem. The British call this a crotchet, and it's equal to 1/4 of a whole note and 1/2 of a half note. The next note is an eighth note, and this is comprised of a closed note head with a stem and a flag. The British call this a quaver. It's equal to 1/8 of a whole note, 1/4 of a half note, and 1/2 of a quarter note. The next one is the 16th note, and it's comprised of a closed note head with a stem and two flags. The British call this a semiquaver. It's equal to 1/16 of a whole note, 1/8 of a half note, 1/4 of a quarter note, and 1/2 of an eighth note. Notes continue to break down like this infinitely. Once you get to the level of the eighth note, where you have the closed note head and a flag, they just keep accruing flags, and that's how you can determine what type of note it is. So for instance, a 32nd note has 3 flags, and the note next down on the level is the 64th note, and that has 4 flags. The 128th note would have 5 flags, so on and so forth. So I've gone ahead and I have brought up a document which illustrates the relation of the different notes. You'll see that over here we have a whole note, and there's just one of them. In this next measure, there are 2 half notes, illustrating that there are 2 half notes in a whole. There are 2 halves in a whole. Okay, over here we have quarter notes, and there are 4 quarter notes, 4 quarters in one whole, and 2 quarters in 1/2. There are 8 eighth notes in one whole note. there are 4/8 notes in 1/2 note, and there are 2/8 notes in 1/4 note. The same system holds true for the 16th notes, which we have over here. There are 16 16th notes in one whole note, 8 in 1/2 note, 4 in 1/4 note, and 2 in 1/8 note. So that note relation, that binary note relation, continues onward. Down we have 32nd notes, we can have 64th notes, 124th. There's really no limit to what we can have. But probably if you're a wind player or a bagpipe player, you're not going to see anything much beyond 32nd notes. If you're a snare drummer, you might see the occasional 64th note, but you need to be familiar with these 5 basic notes and how they work. And once you are, you'll be able to intuit the relation of the 32nd, 64th, 128th notes pretty easily. So I'm going to go ahead and play this for you, and hopefully what you should hear is the basic 1 to 2 relationship of the whole note to the half notes to the quarter notes to the eighth notes, and the eighth notes to the 16th notes. You'll hear audibly what it sounds like to break things down in this binary relationship. Now, one of the interesting things about that is that I have 2 instruments here. I have bagpipes up here playing a B, and then I have a snare drum down here. And you'll notice, especially over here in the whole notes and the half notes, that the bagpipe has a longer sustain than the snare drum. The snare drum just hits the drum and that's it, and then waits for the next note to begin. So there's a lot of empty space there, while the bagpipe holds it out all the way to the beginning of the next note. Now there are things we can do to the notes, which will come in a later module, that can augment the length of the snare drum. For instance, adding tremolos to make it a roll, so you get a long buzz sound comprised of a bunch of little taps on the snare drum. But in this case, we don't have that, and basically the drummer just hits the drum, and that's it. So I'm going to play this one more time, and when I do, listen again to the difference between the sustain between the bagpipes and the snare drum. Contrast the 2 sounds. So when we previously went over notes, we went over 8th notes, 16th notes, and I indicated also that 32nd notes and 64th notes all had flags, and they looked like this, and I'll make it up here, which is out of the bagpipe's practical range, but there's a very clear 8th note there. You can see it. It's in bright pink, and it's comprised of a closed note head, a stem, and a flag. That is unlike the other 8th notes that we have down here in the snare drum. You can see that they're all beamed together like that. And what happens is when 8th notes are close together, when they're right next to each other, they get beamed together like that. Their flags connect, and it makes a straight line across. Okay, and I'll show you that right now by putting an 8th note right next to it. Again, that's the B, and that's probably not in the bagpipe's practical range. So we'll move these guys back down. I'll move it to that guy to a C and that guy to an E. And so they're not the only 2 notes that have this correlation. If I switch over here to 16th notes, you'll see there's a 16th note with 2 flags. Here's another 16th note, and they've beamed themselves together, but you'll see that they've beamed themselves together with both flags, so they have 2 lines there. Okay, so 16th notes will do it too. 32nd notes will do the same thing, 64th notes. Every note with flags, the flags will try to connect when they're next to another note with flags. And that's also the case for mixed notes. Okay, so we have 2 16th notes here, and I'm going to add an 8th note right there, and you'll see that the 8th note beamed itself to those 2 16th notes. And that happened because this one flag correlated to the one flag on the top flag on the 16th notes. But you'll notice that the 16th notes still have another beam under it, and the 8th note does not, because the 8th note has one flag and the 16th notes have two flags. So I'll move these guys back down into the bagpipe practical range, and I'll just put them on B's for now. Move them down a whole octave. In addition to notes, there's another important musical concept, and that is the concept of rests. Rests are signs which indicate to the performer that they should stop playing for a prescribed amount of time. And this is a concept that's going to be foreign to bagpipe players, because bagpipe players very seldom rest, because their bag is normally full of air and it makes the bagpipe very difficult to start and stop. So a bagpipe player will normally begin a tune and keep playing all the way to the end of the tune without stopping in between. What I've done here is I've returned us to our whole note, half note, quarter note, eighth note, 16th note sheet, and it will be important because you will be able to see that each note has a correlating rest. And down here in the snare line, I'm going to be turning the notes into their correlating rests. So to begin with, we have the whole note, and the whole note's correlating rest is the whole rest. And let me go ahead and turn that into a whole rest right now. There we go. And the whole rest looks like a little man came by on the ledger line there and dug a hole in it. So that's a good way to remember the whole rest. The half note has a half rest, and the half rest sits on top of the ledger line. It's the exact same symbol as the whole note, only it sits on top of the ledger line. So there are two half notes, and a good way to remember these is they look like hats, little hats on the ledger line there, and that's sort of, it's a near rhyme with half, so you can remember hat, half note, half rest. The quarter note is a very different shape from the whole note and the whole rest and the half rest. It's a little squiggle like that runs through the ledger line. And no neat tricks to remembering that, you just have to remember that the little squiggle means a quarter rest. The eighth rest begins a system of rests. It's a slash with a flag on it, and it's just one flag for an eighth note. But again, this, like I said, this is a system, so the 16th note has two flags, so this will be a slash with two little flags. The 16th rest has two little flags, just like the 16th note has two little flags. So there we go. There is a whole system of whole rests, half rests, quarter rests, eighth rests, and 16th rests. Well, that does it for my first installment of Kevin's Musical Info-Rama. This module has been about music notes and rests, and I hope it was informative. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me on the interwebs via my YouTube channel, and if you're one of the privileged few lucky enough to have my email address, you may also use that to send me a question, and I will get back to you guys as soon as I can.